So I am Lorna Shaw. I'm a ruminant nutritionist for SAC Consulting, and I've been very privileged to be part of the Argyllshire Monitor Farm since near enough the beginning. So it's been a pleasure to get to work on the farm and delve into the system a little bit more. So obviously the Suckler Cow project started coming about when we realised we had a lot of data to try and sift through. And when we identified the cow goals, we realised that we needed to actually look at heifer replacement a bit more and how we're selecting those heifers and trying to select heifers that are going to go into the herd and meet those goals as much as possible. As part of the Suckler Cow project as well, we also did a bit of rationing. We looked at selection protocols and like what sort of data we need to be collecting. But in turn, a lot of the data we had there, we can do a lot with. And I think that was one of the biggest take homes is having weights of cows, having weights of calves was some of the simplest but easiest data, and we can learn a lot from that and manage to do a lot with that data going forward. So that's one of the things we wanted to pull into the project, but then also into a calculator at the end of the day. So I'll run you through first. We're going to go into kind of what we looked at for heifer selection, first of all. So the farm were traditionally selecting heifers based on live weight at time of selection. So from that, we were kind of ending up with kind of heaviest heifers, which is one good way. However, it also kind of selects for those that are earliest born, which isn't a bad thing because that usually means they're taken to the bulls early. But there's also a lot more data that we can use and start looking at some of those factors to achieve the goals that Craig was talking about. So we kind of looked at flipping the selection protocol on its head a little bit. So we first got our data set, and Craig had a very, very in-depth data set that they've been working with Farm Matters over the last number of years. So I had access to Farm Matters, and they were also very helpful in this project. But first we sorted all the heifers by their 200-day weight. The reason I went with the 200-day weight is that gives us good indication about how that heifer performed on the dam, how well the dam milked, the kind of growth on the dam as well, especially the fact that there was no creep in there. We knew that kind of heifer's growth potential was quite heavily influenced by dam during that 200-day weight process, and then also the grazing in front of it. And then we looked at current weight as well. We can't discredit current weight because when we were looking at calving down heifers at 2, which Craigans were, we need them to be hitting ideally 60% of their live weight before bulling. So current weight was quite important. So we knew, was that heifer on track to be hitting 60% of its mature weight before we put them out to the bull, just to give us the best chance of fertility in the first calving as well. After which we put in criteria in order of priority. So obviously fertility was one of the most important things we identified. And from this, we looked at dam calving interval, which we already had that all the data there, which was generated by Farm Matters already. So just by putting in calving dates, it's also available on MyHerdStats.eid, so it's fairly readily accessible data for us. With the 410-day calving interval as well, we set this to try and select heifers from dams that had a calving interval of less than 400 days. To try and kind of promote fertility, cows that are consistently getting back in bull. Then we also looked at the heifer's daily live weight gain. Ideally, we wanted a daily live weight gain from birth of an average of more than 0.9 kilos a day, just to make sure we're selecting heifers with a good growth potential and that we're performing well. We also wanted a heifer that was ideally from a dam that held her body condition score, her body condition well. Obviously, when we're looking at potential to outwinter, when we're looking at an ideal cow for outwintering, we want something that's functional, holds weight on her back, and can withstand the harsh environment without these massive swings in condition. We know from a lot of research, especially Simon Turner's work on body condition, which Monitor Farm have actually done a lot of workshops with as well, find that there's a real sweet spot in body condition between about body condition score 2.5 and body condition score 3.5. So we'd ideally like the cow to sit in that safe zone all the time. So from this, we tried to select heifers from dams that were body condition score 2.5 or more than that, and less than body condition score 4. If we've got dams that are too lean, we're looking at dams that are potentially milking off their own back more. Yes, they might be putting into the calf, but then we've got to feed extra to try and get that weight back on for bulling, or they might be kind of limiting chance of fertility. And we were trying to avoid cows that were consistently too heavy also. And then we wanted to look at cow efficiency. So the cow efficiency figure is the percentage of calves weaned versus the weight of the dam at weaning. It is important for this fact that the calf is corrected to 200 days and that we're factoring body weight, but I'll talk about that a wee bit further when we look at the calculator. And that was to really look at how productive that cow is. Ideally, we're aiming for an average of about 42% across the herd, which would be the industry benchmark. But we made sure that cow efficiency in this case was above 32% at a very least. And I think as we move through the project, move through selections, this is one that if we can start seeing improvement, we can start maybe upping the goals a little bit more as we go forward. This is by no means a hard and fast. So once we looked at that criteria, I sorted all the data and all the heifers for that year and categorised them into kind of a traffic light system. So any heifer marked green met all the criteria. She was okay for selection, good to go. Anything that was orange maybe missed out on one criteria, hopefully by not too much. Anything that was like really, really far out in the criteria got marked down. But something that was fairly close to meeting criteria, but just not quite there, or they just maybe missed out on one by a smaller margin. And these were orange, so they can be retained if they're required, but we kind of got a stop and wait with them. And then we've got our red category. So these were heifers that missed out on more than one criteria, or one criteria by a particularly large percentage. And this meant that ideally, on paper, these should not be kept for breeding, based on the data that was sitting in front of us. I then presented Craig and Thomas, their stocksman, and the rest of the family with a nice list of heifers that were all categorised into my green, orange, and red categories. And they could then select them as they were going through them. So this meant that the farm could identify any kind of heifers that were from dams with particularly bad calving difficulties, or heifers with dams from a bad temperament that they might also not consider putting into the farm. So we did use a mix of data and also stocksmanship, because we can never discredit stocksmanship in a selection process. So that was kind of in terms what we looked at for heifers. And then we also identified in the project that with this, and as we look to kind of improve the herd as we go forward, it made sense, and it was something that we were kind of doing to a degree, but we're kind of looking now to make it a bit more official, is splitting the herd at Craig into an A and a B herd. So essentially the A herd will look like the highest performing cows, and these will be the ones that are put to a maternal sire for breeding replacements. So trying to look at those ones that will maybe go back to the Angus for breeding heifer replacements again. And ideally we want this A herd to be outwintered and want to try and move them to calving outdoors. So trying to get a functional cow that fits the system from that A herd. From the B herd, they are slightly lower performing cows that maybe don't fit the system quite as well. So cows that end up particularly lean after weaning, or the cows that just don't outwinter well. Some just don't withstand it. So we can try and put them into a B herd and then put them to the terminal sire for breeding store calves. This just also meant that we can look at herd improvements without culling too heavily at the same time. Obviously, we still need to cull problems out the herd, but it allows a B herd to almost give cows a second chance. Obviously, in the fact we wanted to look at profitability, and it was definitely a question raised of, what more can we use this data from? being a nutritionist, I'm quite used to the fact that dry matter intake is very heavily driven by weight. And this was something that kind of raised a few questions. And obviously, like when we started looking at the data, we realized that there was a really big variation between cow weight and performance as we went across the herd. So we actually ranged from the kind of lightest heifer, which was around about 550 kilos, up until the heaviest cow that was about 930 kilos. So there was a big variation in weight between the lightest and the heaviest suckler in that herd, albeit differences in age too. So that led us quite nicely into developing the Profitable Cow Calculator and looking at the data in terms of profitability. So the main aim for the calculator was to try and make a simple tool to help suckler farmers determine the potential profitability of the herd based on a calf margin over feed cost. So I realised with all these tools, they can start growing arms and legs quite fast. And I was quite keen to make sure we didn't grow too many arms and too many legs and make it far too complicated. So I wanted something that required a fairly minimal input of data to try and get some useful figures out without going into full enterprise costings. I'll discuss opportunity for that as we go on. Obviously, we can keep looking, but the kind of main aim of the calculator was to try and make a tool that starts with looking at profitability. So it's just kind of a bit of a gentle push into benchmarking and using a bit more data. The tool will also include cow efficiency figures. So an easier way to calculate cow efficiency if you're not already using quite a lot of data management software that might already calculate this for you. We'll also look at a value of calf at weaning, which is quite an important factor. If you're selling suckled store calves, you're probably quite used to your value of calf at weaning. However, it can also be used as a decision-making tool as to whether we sell at weaning or whether we maybe keep them on for a wee bit and feed. Is there enough margin, depending on selling them as a bit more of a forward store and perhaps like March or further on. And then also looking at the potential of selling that calf as a suckled calf versus finishing it. For some systems. So it can really be adapted for system. And because we're looking at ration costs, I've also included a bit of a kind of nice, quick suckler ration and cost calculator in there just to make calculating the cost of the ration and checking that the ration is sufficient a bit easier. So there's probably quite a lot of uses for the calculator. I think it's really a comparison tool, and it can be used to compare a lot of different systems. So for Craigan's, when we looked at the project, we've used it to compare the cost of outwintering versus housing. Also in my example today, I've used it to compare kind of heifers over some aged cows. We can look at an autumn calving herd versus a spring calving herd. We could look at comparing cows of different live weights, comparing age categories like I've looked at in today's webinar, comparing performance of different breeds and farm perhaps, summering systems. So if we looked at rotational versus set stocking, so we can look at performance of that, and feeding creep to calves versus not. If there's any consultants on the call as well, it could also be used as a benchmarking tool between farmer groups, which is definitely something I see as a benefit going forward, being a consultant myself. Inputs are hopefully fairly simple. One of the main inputs is we've got to know the cow live weight, and I think this is one of the most important things to know in any herd for accurate rationing, for performance. Knowing your average cow live weight is a pretty important factor. We need some basic ration details, so predominantly kind of what's the dry matter fed as rationed. So if we've rationed for the average cow, we just put the dry matter of that in. And the cost of that ration per cow per day, which if you work with a nutritionist and provide feed costs alongside that, should be fairly easy to figure out. I've also included bedding costs. I haven't done whole enterprise calculations, but we did want to count bedding, especially for comparing house versus wintering systems. and total numbers of cow on farm. That just allows us to figure out some of the margin over feed costs on a whole herd basis rather than just individual bases. You want to look at it on a larger scale than the individual. Need the calf weight at weaning, which must be corrected to 200 days. Many management softwares will already correct it to 200 days for you. I think one of the most important factors when we are correcting a calf weight to 200 days, and this just makes all calves a bit more comparable because we'll have differences in age depending on bulling periods. But we do need to look make sure we're factoring in a birth weight of that calf. If we don't factor in a birth weight, we tend to favour calves that were born later on in the calving period. So it's really, really important we factor birth weight into that calculation for 200 days. We also need calf feed costs and length of time fed if we're feeding creep, and the value of in pence per kilo of the calves at weaning. This is basically based on the suckle calf store price. So if you were weaning in October, for example, we're looking at October suckle calf sales. So the outputs we should get from the calculator are our ration costs per cow and per herd based on the cow's live weight. We should also get total costs, which include bedding, if applicable, a cow efficiency percentage, a calf value at weaning, calf costs to weaning in pounds per calf, and margin over feed costs on an individual basis in a whole herd. And the ration costs and total costs are also on a daily basis and over the whole period as well. So we can get quite a lot of data from it. And this is just a wee sneak peek at my ration calculator, but we'll run through the Suckler Cow Calculator just now quickly so you can see what we are doing. If it lets me. Let me swap through it nicely. Perfect. Can we see the calculator?
Yep, we can see it. Okay, Lorna, maybe just bring it up in size a wee bit if that's okay. Thank you.
Perfect. So the calculator is an Excel tool. I have locked it, so it should be fairly unbreakable. I mean, I locked it that well this afternoon that I couldn't even get into it. So luckily we fixed that one. But no, so the start screen of the calculator just basically gives you an introduction, roughly what I've went through, and a bit of a description of the data input tabs and what the outputs are and the measurements. We've got suggested scenarios in there, but that's open to interpretation as well. And a bit of an instruction. Basically, any filled cell is a data input cell. All other cells in the calculator should be locked. So you only really need to put data input into any cell that's been filled. So moving on to the first tab, we have the data input tab. So this is where we're going to put all of our data in the calculator. I've pre-populated our first tab, so we've decided to compare the group of heifers versus some sixth calvers, which were from the Craigens herd. We actually did look at outwintering housing as well, but I can tell you some of that. So we can basically, at the start in the scenario ID, we can alter these, so I can name them. So we've popped in heifers and sixth calvers. We can put our average suckler weight in. So the average suckler weight of the sixth calvers was 729 kilos versus heifers at 630 kilos. We can look in at stage of production in our dry period. So we can change this between dry and lactation, and it's just on a drop-down menu. So if we change to lactation, we see that our predicted dry matter intake increases. So we're altering it for dry matter intake. If we were looking at a cow throughout her whole year, we could adjust that between dry and lactation and maybe just do it over 2 and the average figures after. But we're comparing them both in the dry period at the moment. For the sake of comparison, we're just going to look at them both house. So the ration, the average ration at Craigens was last year was about £1.67 per head per day, and that was based on silage at I think £40 a tonne in a pit. And our ration dry matter, I think we dry mattered for the average cow at 730 kilos, which is actually the same weight as the 6 calvers. So it was about 11 kilos dry matter we were aiming to feed. And that'll just calculate ration as a cost per kilo dry matter, but that self-calculates for you. Our length of time housing, we're just going to base this on 180 days winter. For argument's sake, and our total numbers of sucklers in the system, there was 9 6 calvers in the herd. Our bedding costs were roughly worked out at 50p per cow per day, so about £4.50 for that herd. So then we need to put a calf data in. So the 6 calvers average calf weight was 276 kilos. And they don't feed any creep, so that can go at 0. And the average calf value from the last Isla sale actually was about 434. So we can see, we can get a quick indication of margin over feed costs for these 2 cows. So interestingly, our margins over our heifers and our 6 calvers were about £1.50 a difference. We can see for there. If we move over to the output tab, this will all self-calculate as you put the inputs in. So we can see that our heifers' daily ration cost per head was about £1.43 versus it's costing us about £1.66 for our 6 calvers. Obviously, the 6 calvers being slightly larger, it's costing us more to keep maintenance on that cow. And this increased our total daily costs, including bedding. So our ration cost over whole winter works out over the whole winter period. And then we've got the total herd cost. This was just based on the total number of animals we put in. Obviously, we had a lot more heifers. We had 35 heifers versus 9 6 calvers. So obviously that price is quite different. The cow efficiency is calculated. So we can see the average heifer efficiency was 42.4%. So that's kind of hitting that average industry benchmark of 42% for the heifers. And the 6 calvers were just falling slightly short of that, about 38% on suckler herd efficiency. So we can see that the 6 calvers compared to the heifers, being a slightly larger cow, are costing us slightly more, and they're slightly less efficient compared to the heifers. The calf value at weaning, we've got a slightly lower value weaning at weaning for the heifers versus the 6 calvers, just due to size of animal. So then we can see where the margins have came in. If we wanted to, we could look at the impact of adding a bit of creep in here, and then that would change your margin. So if we looked at about 65 pence a day, which would be about 2 kilos of creep roughly, and feeding for 60 days to these calves, we can see how it impacts our margin quite quickly. So we could use that as a tool as well. To help us get some of the data, I know kind of sometimes our rationing costs or our rations aren't always handy. I have done a rough calculator. It is very much based on looking at cow for maintenance. Calculator should be fairly easy to use again. So if we have a 730 kilo cow in her dry period, we'd expect her to eat about 10.95 kilos. And then we can check our ration against it. So if we have a fairly wet silage, we can change the dry matter of the silage. We can put the energy up. So if we have a 10 ME, put 10.1 ME, that was the average this year, and a crude protein of 12%, can add that in, and we can pop the feed cost. So £40 a tonne is a nice average, so we can see how much we need. We're maybe only feeding 35 kilos of this, and then we might want to feed a bit more straw. So we can look at the ration there. Again, self-populated straw because it doesn't tend to vary that much, but we can change the price in front of us. And then we've got minerals in there as well, again, self-populated, but we can change our cost of our minerals there to see our impact of our ration. So that gives us a ration cost and our total dry matter intake, which were two of the inputs as well. So that kind of leaves me quite nicely to the end.